What was in her heart? From Splendours from Ramoutsa by Herman Bosman. No, Oom said. I don't know why it is that people always ask me to tell them stories. Even though they all know that I can tell better stories than anybody else. Much better. What I mean is, I wonder why people listen to stories. Of course, it is easy to understand why a man should ask me to tell him a story when there's a drought in the Mariku. Because then he can sit on the stoep and smoke his pipe and drink coffee while I'm talking, so that my story keeps him from having to go to the borehole in the hot sun to pump water for his cattle. By the earnest manner in which the farmers of the Mariku ask me for stories at certain periods, I'm always able to tell that there's no breeze to drive the windmill, and that the pump handle's heavy, and that the water's very far down. And at such times, I've often observed the look of sorrow that comes into a man's eyes when he knows that I am near the end of my story, and that he will shortly have to reach for his hat. And when I have finished the story, he says, Yes, Oom, that's the way of the world. Yes, that story's very deep. But I know that all the time he's really thinking of how deep the water is in the borehole. As I've said, it's when people have other reasons for asking me to tell them a story that I start wondering, as I do now. When they ask me, at those times when there's no ploughing to be done and there are no barbed wire fences to be put up in the heat of the day. And I think that these reasons are deeper than any stories, and deeper than the water in the boreholes when there is a drought. There was young Christian Giel, for instance. He once listened to a story. It was foolish of him to have listened, of course, especially as I hadn't told it to him. He'd heard it from the Indian behind the counter of the shop in Ramoutsa. Christian Giel related this story to me, and I told him straight out that I didn't think much of it. I said anybody could guess right from the start why the princess was sitting beside the well. Anybody could see that she hadn't come there just because she was thirsty. I also said that the story was too long, and that even if I was thinking of something else, I would still have told it in such a way that people would have wanted to hear it to the end. I pointed out lots of other details like that. Christian Giel said he had no doubt that I was right, but that the man who had told him the story was an Indian after all, and that for an Indian, perhaps, it wasn't too bad. He also said that there were quite a number of customers in the place, and that made it more difficult for the Indian to tell the story properly, because he had to stand at such an awkward angle all the time, weighing out things with his foot on the scale. By his tone, it sounded as though Christian Giel was quite sorry for the Indian. So I spoke to him very firmly. The Indian in the store at Ramoutsa, I said, has told me much better stories than that before today. He once told me that there were no burnt mealies mixed with the coffee beans he sold me. Another one that was almost as good when he said
And to think that the princess went and waited by the well,
Christian Giel interrupted me.
just because once she had seen the young man there.
Another good one, I insisted, was when he said there was no Kalahari sand in the sack of yellow sugar I bought from him.
And she's only seen him once.
Christian Giel went on.
And she was a princess.
And I had to give most of that sugar to the pigs, I said. It didn't melt or sweeten the coffee. It just stayed like mud at the bottom of the cup.
She waited by the well because she was in love with him.
Christian Giel ended up lamely. I just mixed it in with the pig's mealie meal, I said. They ate it very fast. It's funny how fast a pig eats. Christian Giel didn't say any more after that one. No doubt he realized that I wasn't going to allow him to impress me with a story told by an Indian, and not very well told either. I could see what the Indian's idea was. Just because I had stopped buying from his shop after that unpleasantness about the coffee beans and the sugar, which were only burnt mealies and Kalahari sand, as I explained to a number of my neighbors, he had hit on this uncalled for way of paying me back. He was setting up as my rival. He was going to tell stories. And on account of the long start I had on him, he was using all sorts of unfair methods, like putting princesses in his stories, and palaces, and elephants that were all dressed up with yellow and red hangings, and that were trained to trample on the king's enemies at the word of command. Whereas the only kind of elephants I could talk about were those that didn't wear red hangings or gold bangles, and that didn't worry about whether or not you were the king's enemy. They just trampled on you first anyhow, and without any sort of training either. At first, I felt it was very unfair the Indian to come along with stories like that. I couldn't compete. But when I thought it over carefully, I knew that it didn't matter. The Indian could tell all the stories he liked about the princess riding around on an elephant. For there was one thing I knew I could always do better than the Indian. In just a few words, and without even talking about the princess, I would be able to let people know subtly what was in her heart. And this was more important than the palaces and the temples and the elephants with gold ornaments on their feet. Perhaps the Indian realized the truth of what I'm saying now. At all events, after a while, he stopped wasting the time of his customers with stories of emperors, in between telling them that the price of sheep dip and axle grease had gone up. Or perhaps his customers grew tired of listening to him. The days passed and the drought came, and the farmers of the Mariku put in much of their time at boreholes, pushing the heavy pump handles up and down. The Indians' brief period of storytelling was almost forgotten. Even Christian Giel came to admit that there was such a thing as overdoing these stories of magnificence.
All these things he says about temples and so on,
Christian Giel said,
with white floors and shining red stones in them, and rajas. Do you know what a raja is, Oomskalk? No, I don't know either. You can have too much of that. It was only that one story of his that was any good. The one about the princess. She had rich stones in her hair and pearls sewn onto her dress. And so the young man never guessed why she'd come there. He didn't guess that she loved him, but perhaps I didn't tell you the story properly the first time, Oomskalk. Perhaps I should tell it to you again. I've already told it to many people.
But I declined this offer hurriedly. I replied that there was no need for him to go over all that again. I said that I remembered the story very well, and that if it was all the same to him, I should prefer not to hear it a second time. He might just spoil it in telling it all over again. "Why are you so interested in that story?" I said. "Is because you like to imagine yourself as that young man." Christian Gill agreed with me that this was the reason why the Indian story had appealed to him so much. And he went on to say that a young man had no chance, really, in the Mariku. What with the droughts and the cattle getting milk sick and the mosquitoes buzzing around so that you couldn't sleep at night. And when Christian Gill left me, I could see very clearly how much he envied the young man in the Indian story. As I have said before, there are some strange things about stories and about the people who listen to them. I thought so particularly on a hot afternoon a few weeks later when I saw Letty Viljoen. The sun shone on her upturned face and on her bright yellow hair. She sat with one hand pressed in the dry grass of last summer, and I thought of what a graceful figure she was, and how slender her wrists were. And because Letty Viljoen hadn't come there riding on an elephant with orange trappings and gold bangles, and because she wasn't wearing a string of red stones at her throat, Christian Gill knew, of course, that she wasn't a princess. And I suppose this was the reason why, during all the time he was talking to her, telling her the story about the princess at the well, Christian Gill never guessed about Letty Viljoen and what it was that had brought her there in the heat of the sun to the borehole.